Welcome to another edition of the Litigation Psychology Podcast, brought to you by Courtroom Sciences. Dr. Steve Wood. Interesting topic we're going to talk about today. Interesting panel. I'm excited to talk to this panel because this panel actually I have some personal connections with. First and foremost, our first guest him and I go back to 2009 when we actually came into the grad program at the University of Nevada. It was him, me, and three others, and ended up only being four of us who graduated. But I'm still mad at him because he actually graduated before me, slightly before me. He got out of the program, but I was close behind him, so I'm still a little bit upset about that. But my first guest is Michael Williams, Dr. Michael Williams. He goes by Mick, so we'll refer to him as Mick throughout this. Mick is the founding member of the science of PCVE, which actually stands for Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism. Mick has a very impressive resume, which I didn't realize until recently. I looked at it. I'm a little bit jealous of him, but he's a former National Science Foundation graduate research fellow, former senior advisor to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. He's consulted with the White House staff, U.S. Attorney's Office, U.S. State Department, and several other, government entities as it relates to violent extremism. So, Mick, thanks for being on the podcast. I'm happy to have you here.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks, Steve.
And Mick and my success has come a lot from what we learned while we were in the graduate program at the University of Nevada. We had a very interdisciplinary program where we had several different professors that had very different expertise in their topic areas. And I'm lucky to have one of them on the podcast today, Dr. Shawn Marsh. Dr. Shawn Marsh is the director of Judicial Studies. He's also a professor of communication studies and social psychology in, as I said before, the program that Mick and I are actually graduates of. So, Shawn, thanks for being on the podcast too.
Thanks for having me. And I'd also note that I'm a graduate of that program too.
There you go. Really, Mick, what I brought you and Shawn on today is you and I were having a conversation about topics. I wanted to bring you on, and talk to you about some stuff, and when we were talking, you brought up this terror management theory. And as we were talking, kind of a light bulb went off and thought, gee, terror management theory sounds similar to what we've been hearing with reptile theory, the edge tactics. But what I want to do is kind of turn it over to you and have you explain what exactly is terror management theory? What is kind of the principles behind the theory?
Thanks, Steve. I'll present a little PowerPoint presentation in a moment, but just as background, terror management theory is one of the large theories that we've had in social psychology over the past more than 3 decades now. And for many of your viewers, this will be new territory. And so some of what we're about to cover is going to sound rather, audacious. But for those of us in the field, we know that this is it's been replicated in dozens of countries throughout the years, over 500 plus studies now, whether you need Brazil, China, Israel, America, UK, Canada. It seems to be a culturally, culturally common phenomenon. And without further ado, let me dive into what are the basics of this theory. And again, this might be mind-blowing, but I encourage anyone to delve into the research on this. It's an extraordinarily robust database or research foundation. And in our field, it's a bit like, it is to our field, maybe an analogy is like evolutionary theory. If you've never heard about it before, it sounds almost preposterous and almost insulting. How does natural selection occur, etc. But for those of us in social psychology, some of these concepts, which you're going to hear, spoiler alert, death thought, accessibility, and whatnot, these kinds of things are well known, well accepted. And without further ado, what is terror management theory? Let me share the screen for a moment and ask, what do these things have in common? The Sphinx and the pyramids. We have,
and I will pause
notions.
Notions. Let our audience know as you're going through this PowerPoint. Most of this is going to be heard on audio podcast, but if you do want to see the screen that Mick is sharing, I would encourage you to head over to the YouTube page where you can see his presentation along with his impeccable bow tie that he has been known to have and known for throughout the University of Nevada.
It's a little known bylaw of the American Psychological Association that you have to wear a bow tie a certain percentage of time when appearing in public. I believe it's one of those antiquated laws to hold over. It's like a shout out to Freud, I believe. Anyhow, so what do these have in common? The Sphinx and the pyramids, families, war, notions of God and the divine, and Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, dun, 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 which for the music aficionados is an audio representation of fate knocking at the door. Dun, 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 that's what that's supposed to represent. The answer is that there are all ways that humans have coped with mortality. What the heck do we mean by that? It all comes from this original author named Ernest Becker, who once upon a time wrote several books, including a Pulitzer Prize winner called The Denial of Death, written in 1973. And in this, he set forth some philosophy, actually, which later became the fodder for which we tested and developed terror management theory. And when I say we, I don't include myself, although my dissertation was based on this. Terror management theory posits a few things, three things. It's actually quite simple. Number one, humans have a desire for self-presentation. That seems self-evident. But here comes the problem. We as humans, we aren't like dogs and horses. We are aware that someday we are going to die. Okay? Now, most of the time, this is no problem, but it has the potential for overwhelming terror. And you might say, well, on a day-to-day basis, this is no problem. And it isn't, because we as humans have become exceptionally good at keeping those thoughts out of our mind. But if we're being honest with ourselves, raise your hand if you know for a fact that you're not going to die later today. I mean, it sounds absurd. For that matter, all three of us could drop dead 5 minutes after this podcast. Do we know for certain? No. But we are very, very good at sort of minimizing the plausibility in our mind about that. And we also cope with our mortality in a few other ways. Terror management theory says we generally do it one of three ways. One is our cultural worldview. Okay, if this nothing but a dangerous, scary, unpredictable place, we'd be behaving like animals and in survivalist mode 24/7. But instead, we have our cultural worldviews. This is a way for us to make sense of our surroundings, that maybe we're members, however we identify, whether we're Americans or we're members of a family or members of a community, we're members of some sort of culture and some sort of belief in law and order, justice, these kinds of things, that gives us a way to view the world that is not chaotic, that is not so threatening. But that's not the only way. Another way is, believe it or not, maintaining high self-esteem. That if we have a human tendency to try to enhance our self-esteem, no one does that better than Americans, by the way. We are the most self-esteem preserving, self-aggrandizing culture yet studied on Earth, to the latest of my knowledge. And why do we want to preserve our self-esteem? This is one of the fundamental questions of terror management theory, which says, if we have this cultural worldview, how do we know that we're doing a good job of fitting in? And one of those ways we do it is by, say, conforming to the notions of that cultural worldview. And by conforming, we feel better about ourselves. We're good team players, we're good Americans, we're good members of our churches, or, here I am, a bow tie wearing, card carrying psychologist, so I publish papers and whatnot. I feel good about myself. My worldview is preserved and reinforced. And this leads into the last way that people do it. And this is usually more unconscious. It's creating a legacy and a notion that something will live beyond ourselves. And in the case of religion, the kind of immortality, the afterlife, might be actually one of the explicit tenets, that we don't actually die. And isn't that convenient? Because then all of a sudden all this terror goes away if we know we're going to live forever. Okay, but it's not just literal immortality that we're all striving for. In fact, many of us don't believe in the notion of an afterlife. So what are such persons to do? Well, creating what they call a symbolic form of immortality. And that symbolic immortality can be, for example, your family. You start a family, you see your children, the children live on beyond you, and that can be a source of comfort. We can also invest ourselves in our work. Our work lives on beyond ourselves, whatever that work may be. It could be, in the case of Beethoven, his symphonies, or us, the lowly psychologists publishing our papers. Hey, that's a legacy, however small that is. And that's something that can be comforting, and then we can have a certain self-esteem. But it goes beyond that. And I'm going to quit sharing the screen for now, and we can have more of a regular discussion about this, that it's not as rosy a picture as it would seem, that what happens to try to maintain a grip on their cultural worldview? Well, that means if my worldview is threatened, then we've got a problem. And there are many things in our environment which can threaten our worldview. Let's just say that case of religion. Well, if my key to the afterlife is being right, that my notion of God and propriety is right, well, I'm going to cling to that, which means someone else from a different religion, for example, or even someone from a different race, which is highly correlated with a different religion, all of a sudden they become threatening. And this again can be entirely unconscious. It can also be conscious, but the idea is that we will often derogate, look down upon, or even punish those whose worldviews are different from ours, not because we hate them per se, not because hating another person serves an instrumental function, but that it's actually a kind of self-preservation, that it's a way to preserve our sense of reality, our sense of righteousness, our sense of goodness in this world. So again, many good things come about in our ways to try to cope with mortality, building families, building culture, creating our legacies, whether literal or symbolic, but it can also have many, many negative outgroup damaging effects. And I think that will set the stage for some of our later discussion. But with that, I'd like to pause and hand it back to you, Steve.
Yeah, I think when you listen to it, and we won't rehash reptile theory or edge techniques and stuff on the podcast because most of our listeners are already well versed in it. But I think from your conversations that we've had, how do you see that reptile theory and these other concepts really fit into terror management theory? Because the way I see it, and I'll kick it over to you, Shawn, because you see it from a practitioner standpoint, that I can see a lot of these similarities between the idea, like when reptile theory talks about spreading the tentacles of danger, talking about how that danger that happened in this specific case, if gone unpunished, if gone without someone having being sent a message, that it could spread into the community, and now you could be the next victim. So what are your thoughts about how the kind of terror management theory fits into that bucket, and then also the idea that jurors see an opportunity to not only right someone who's been harmed, but also do something that feels good, that they feel like they've made their world better? How do you kind of see that fits with terror management theory?
Yeah. So Dr. Williams, a fantastic overview. I would just plug for the listeners, if you're really interested in kind of the historical background and how terror management came to be, as Mick noted, The Denial of the Death by Ernest Becker is an absolute must read. It was a game changer for me early in the 90s. I was doing more clinical work and was exposed to the thinking. Interestingly, Ernest Becker was a cultural anthropologist, so kind of a social psychology adjacent, I suppose we could argue. But the history and the explanation in his prior work, going back to some of the other thinking, Birth and Death of Meaning, for example, and whatnot, are just really important reads if this is something that's of interest to you in your work. I would say, in summary, to kind of put the elevator speech on Dr. Williams' note there, is think of terror management, and I think to some extent edge theory. And by the way, I'm not an expert on edge theory at all, so I wade into this carefully. But it's this idea that we have a defense mechanism against the fear of death, and that influences or can influence everything from daily behaviors to legal judgments, right? This is a kind of a universal thing that's not specific to courts, but in this context, that's what we're talking about. So we do see it play out. We do see, generally speaking, to kind of start the conversation, an active research agenda still going, working with courts and judges. I have several doctoral students looking at more criminal issues, but just as an example, looking at the mode of execution and how that prompts mortality, salience, and potential jurors, their attitudes and thinking about the death penalty, for example. So there's a lot of nuanced kind of deep dives going on with this research, as you guys well know. The acceptance or use issue, and I may be going a little farther down the line than you intended this soon, Steve, but we can course correct if needed, that this has actually been fairly well received overall by my judge students, by attorneys, by folks doing this work. Not universally so. I think that in 2024, we're all very aware there is some pushback around science and social science and those sort of things. But that aside, the judges that I have been working with for 20 years or so are really open to the social science of this and are open to understanding there is stuff going on, quite frankly, between our ears we're not even aware of, right? And I think I'm going to be quiet here, but Mick, you did a fantastic job setting this up, that this can seem almost existentially bizarro, spacey. What are you talking about? But I really have to emphasize, and I agree with Mick completely, the evidence is here, right? This is not just a willy-nilly, go play in your lab, fun, look at the interesting. There really is a lot of support that this plays out in how we go about making decisions in courts.
And Mick, I want to talk to you a little bit too about there's ways to prime this, right? This mortality salience to kind of engage the whole idea that's behind terror management theory. Can you talk a little bit about how's it get primed? And then I want to also circle back too, just to let you know, is there a way to inoculate a jurors against this too? Because now if we have one side who's trying to prime it, also it helps to know how do you defend against it. But let's start with how you can prime it, and then we'll go back to that.
Those are fantastic questions, Steve. First of all, it's been primed, and for the listeners who aren't familiar with what we're talking about priming, Dr. Wood is asking, how do we bring these things to mind? So if we're saying that humans are concerned with their own mortality, but most of the time we push those thoughts out of our mind, how are psychologists studying this? How are they activating those kinds of thoughts? In other words, how are we priming those kinds of thoughts? And they've been primed many, many different ways. To underscore what they have in common is they can be done very, very subtly. So let me give you an example. Let's just say we had a survey and we asked persons, to rate, the punitiveness, as Shawn mentioned, like say how punitive they would be in a hypothetical death, capital punishment case. Okay. Now, let's say we survey those people on one hand in front of a grocery store, just catching people as they go out, walk on the sidewalk outside a grocery store. Well, we're going to get, what is their average level of punitiveness? And we can measure this on just, on a scale of 1 to 10, how punitive would you be? I'm painting with a broad brush here, but just conceptually speaking. Now, what if we ask those questions, but we did so just outside on a sidewalk, but it just so happened that it was outside of a cemetery? We didn't make any big hoopla about it. We didn't draw attention to the fact that we're standing next to a cemetery. We're just doing a public opinion poll. It just so happens that our experimental manipulation is the location. And guess what? It's astonishing. It almost makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck. But just as terror management theory would predict, that subliminal, that subconscious awareness of a mortality prime, in this case, the cemetery, is enough to make people uneasy. And how do they relieve that uneasiness? Well, they affirm their sense. They affirm their sense of their worldview. And guess what? Punitiveness would tend to go up in that same exact survey with just another convenient sample of people, passers-by. But it can be done even more subtly than that. In a scientific laboratory, we can do priming with computer screens where you can flash an image on screen so fast that no one can consciously report that they've even seen anything. I mean, and by the way, this isn't just a bunch of nefarious social psychologists. All of this is done with institutional review oversight, and everybody is debriefed afterwards. No one is, this is not brainwashing. This is not mind control. But nevertheless, studies have shown that if you flash just a few characters on the screen in black and white, the numbers 911. Well, to any American, 9/11 means something. Also, even for older generations, the letters WTC. What the heck does that mean? It actually means World Trade Center. You might not even be aware of that. But if we prime participants versus another gibberish, let's say we just go XYZ, which means nothing in particular. Guess what? Those people primed with those subtle things, 9/11, WTC, we can show that they have more death on their mind. How do we know that? Well, we have some pretty sneaky ways of doing that. We ask them to complete the following word: COF blank blank. Fill in those blanks. EE. What is COFFE? Excuse me, COFF blank blank. Well, you can complete that two ways. You could complete that if you wrote that in. Some of you are going to put in EE, coffee. Okay. Or you could also complete that cough-in. How about this one? G-U blank. What is that word? Just tell me the first word that comes into your mind. Is it G-U-M? Is it gum? Or is it G-U-N? Is it gun? Well, guess what? Those people who've been subliminally primed with something so subtle as 9/11 or World Trade Center, they're more likely to complete, and by that more likely, I mean literally more than 50% compared to the comparison group, more likely to complete those with what we would call death compatible ideas. So those people are going to complete those words as coffin or gun. And there's several lists of these types of words which have been developed for this type of research, but it's amazing. So how subtle can you get? Because not only are they practically, they're just characters, they're not even complete words, 911, WTC. Not only are they so subtle that way, but the participants don't even report having seen them. So you can prime this oh so subtly. So when we talk about a courtroom, let's talk about a not so subtle prime. Let's talk about the American flag that's in, to my knowledge, every American courtroom. That is a prime for our cultural worldview. That is a prime for God bless America. Arguably, it's a prime for notions of God in itself, at least in American context, we're such a God-fearing nation. So in a sense, in every courtroom, there is a prime that says, hey, our worldview is correct, and we should punish those who deviate from that. And if I may take another minute here, Steve, going back to the edge technique and reptile theory, that's what I believe is how terror management theory informs that, which is not when someone is caught in basically cornered by the questioning of the edge technique. You say, do you agree that safety is your number one concern? And everybody nods their head. Yes, of course. Do you believe that, the care of your patients is the number one concern, or safety driving your truck is the most important concern? Who's not going to agree to that if they're a truck driver or a physician? And then they subtly point out, inconsistencies in their behavior that were not congruent with that initial agreement. Now, why would a jury be so punitive about that? Terror management theory would say it's our way. When I say our, I mean humans' way of restoring a sense of security, of making sense of the world, of basically punishing deviance. Okay, that's basically what terror management theory would say is our worldview. Is our sense of righteousness, basically our sense of correctness. It's our grasp on reality. So what we want to do is defend that, and defend it we will. And one of those ways is to punish what we would perceive as a deviance. And someone who's caught being a hypocrite, that's tantamount to being a liar, even if it's just an accident. Any kind of perceived hypocritical behavior goes against our tribe. They are a deviant. And terror management theory would say that's why we're going to be punitive in those situations, is to restore order and punish deviance.
And I think that ties in perfectly with the concepts that we're talking about from a civil realm, is the whole idea of hypocrisy. And one of the big things with reptile theory and edge is to poke holes in the defense and to show how much of a hypocrite they are, to then cause people. And I guess we'll talk about that, and I want to circle back, Shawn, and I want to talk to you about this. Showing that they're a hypocrite and kind of identifying the fact that they're a deviant and that they're a lie. One of the big things that the edge talks about is try the lie, and essentially that there's a lie in every case. Find the lie and then try the lie. And I think a lot of that goes back to, like I said, the concepts of terror management theory as well, is that person becomes a deviant, that person becomes a danger, and now that person needs to be taught a lesson. But I guess, I wanted to get your thoughts a little bit too, Shawn, about how, what Mick's talking about is the whole idea of deviance and people being a danger to society, how that kind of plays in and how you see it tie in with what we've been seeing.
Yeah. So, to back up a little bit and kind of work towards that general, just a few comments to support Dr. Williams' points there. The subtlety issue is a fascinating one to me. I study a lot of environmental psychology and particularly how it plays out within the courtroom. And Mick, I'm delighted you brought up the American flag. We see courtrooms with "In God We Trust." We see different seals, all kinds of different things that could be kind of priming. But above and beyond that, we got to remember that case details themselves, right? And even in civil situations, severe injury, death, harm, anything that kind of triggers our own reflection about a mortality certainly qualifies, given the subtleness that Mick talks about. there's a crossover here too, and this gets to one of your original questions, Dr. Wood, about what do we do about it, right? What's the intervention stuff? But I also study trauma-informed courts and justice and the overlap with environment. And I think that that's one of the techniques, or one of those intervention points, is being supremely aware of the environment in the courtroom. And not just the signs and primes and potential triggers and getting people thinking about consciously or non-consciously about their mortality, but also things that generate stress and increase cognitive load. Jurors and judges are faced with making decisions about oftentimes very complex sets of information and facts, and teasing out the truths. And you really want to provide what we know as psychologists, the best grounds for decision making. And that's to make sure that the environment is quiet, calm, centered, all those kind of basic sort of things, up to and including, by the way, light levels. I mean, we've got all kinds of environmental psychology points that can help reduce stress. So stress, that's one point right there. Being aware of the environment, being aware of the potential subtle primes in your evidence. And then there's the more interactive techniques. And I'd be really interested, you guys, I'm sure, have examples too. But one of the common ones is really, if this is introduced and there's concerns about the mortality and is it going to impact decision making and whatnot, but to, for example, take a step to really humanize a target, right? Your client or organization you're representing, but to put a human face on it is one step. And another kind of follow-up step to that is point out common grounds, right? To break down these subtle psychological in-group, out-group sort of formations that Dr. Williams described so perfectly. So I think I might have missed your ultimate question there, but those were kind of the build-in to, hopefully we can address that question next.
No, I think it's good. I think one thing you talk about humanizing the face, and I think one thing that comes up from the defense side is humanizing the corporation. And I know there's good and bad ways to do that, which we talked about before on the podcast. But I think that is important as a way to do it. It needs to be done right, though. I mean, I guess, do you have any thoughts about how you see humanizing the individuals that people can take away? Because I think too often, and tell me if this is wrong, but too often I hear from attorneys that the way to humanize the corporation is to say, they're made up of 40,000 people, but they're all individuals, and each one of them puts their pants on just like you and goes and kisses their kids goodbye when they go to work. And a lot of times I don't see that working because a lot of people who are jaded against large corporations kind of don't buy into that. So I guess, do you have any thoughts about how you would humanize an individual a little bit different than probably what that way is?
I'm going to say a really quick answer, and then I'm going to dump this to Mick, because this had so much to do with his dissertation and background. I'll say this, Dr. Wood, I agree with you. I think that shotgun, look, there are 40,000 people doing the exact same thing. You as an individual is probably going down a not very fruitful road. I think trying to identify a prototypical representative of the group, the organization, the system that is closely matched to your juror kind of profile would make more sense, more of an individual connection. But Mick, would love to hear your thoughts.
That's perfect. Mick, before I spin it over to you, actually, I think I want to just hit on that point, Shawn, which is perfect. It goes back to what we talk about for our listeners. That's the corporate rep, right? That's the person who's going to be sitting at the table. You want them to be humanized when they're at counsel's table, when they're testifying, because that's the way you humanize the corporation, at least from that standpoint. But Mick, I'll turn it over to you to give a more scientific, more in-depth approach. I didn't realize that was part of your dissertation topic either, so I'm waiting to hear this.
Yes, my dissertation was terror management theory upside down. I won't bore you with the full title, but it's basically how can we reverse some of these effects of terror management? Because just to sort of memorandize our discussion right now, it would seem like the deck is stacked against the defense. If we're saying that every courtroom is primed either through something like the flag or the procedures, or as Dr. Marsh mentioned, even the facts of the case that, someone has been injured, someone has maybe died, that the deck is stacked against the defense, that it's a very punitive prone environment. Okay, well, we can use terror management theory to sort of do some jujitsu here to favor. And Dr. Marsh hit upon the biggest one, which is if we know that when our worldview is threatened, what do we want to do? We want to we want to play favorites to our in-group and punish the out-group, okay? So anything you can do to make that defendant be cast in terms of the in-group, that this person is one of us. This is a law-abiding American. This is a father. This is a member of our community. Any type of identity-based approach that the attorneys could highlight. So now all of a sudden, like, raise your hand if you want to put your mother in jail. Do you know what I mean? Raise your hand if you want to throw the book at your brother. We bend over backwards for those that we perceive to be our kinfolk, so to speak. Okay. So in a nutshell, anything that we can do to make this person on the stand who's in the defensive mode, to make them appear as a member of our, what we call the in-group, which is to say a member of our team, whatever that means, team humanity, will be advantageous. But then there's another subtler way, and this is not focused on the person on the stand. This is focused on the jurors themselves. What we know is the negative effects of terror management theory, where we want to favoritize our in-group and punish the out-group. We can alleviate, in fact, sometimes reduce to nothing, those effects if people are feeling have sufficiently high self-esteem. Self-esteem is, in a sense, a proxy that everything is okay, that everything is safe. Like, if the world is coming to an end, we'd be running around like chickens with our heads cut off. We'd be frantic. We'd be paranoid. We'd be trying to, hoard and preserve and defend ourselves. But if everything is okay, if we can feel good about ourselves, self-esteem is a proxy that everything's okay. So then it's as though people put their knives away, so to speak. I know I'm being a little bit dramatic, but how can we do that in the courtroom? Well, I'm not an attorney, so I'm not exactly sure, but anything you can do to self-affirm the jurors, to make the jurors feel like okay, to help them to feel secure, to help them feel like they're doing. You could even say, it's a great thing that your jury service is much appreciated. We need more people like you. I hope that you feel, regardless of the verdict, I hope that you feel good about your service today, because you're doing a service to our community. You're doing a service to this system of ours, blah, blah, blah. Now all of a sudden feels, oh, we feel really good. And when you feel good about yourself, it's harder to hate on somebody. Do you know what I'm trying to say? And if it's harder to feel bad about somebody, it's harder to punish them. Okay. So, in summary, those two things: emphasize that the defendant is a part of our in-group, however you define that, and you could define it multiple ways if you want. And then also just doing whatever you can to make the jurors feel good about themselves, as we might say, self-affirmation. You could, in social psychology, sometimes we ask them to reflect upon, think about a time when you did something good for somebody else, or think about a time when you accomplished something. You ask people to engage in these little thought experiments, but they're extremely powerful. I mean, I don't want to ramble on here, but even giving a first-year college student that assignment, saying write a paragraph about a time where you lived up to your values. That little exercise at that one point in time is enough to demonstrate statistically higher grade point average at the end of that first year of college compared to the control group. I mean, talk about that, a subtle manipulation. I mean, it's just one little thing, probably took them 5 minutes, and it alters their trajectory on average of their GPA. I mean, when I was a professor, that's just out of a sense, since I was aware of that bit of research, I assigned that to all my students, even though it's only tangentially related to their psychology curriculum. I felt like I needed to give these kids a head, every advantage they could get. So self-affirmation is a potentially powerful tool.
Yeah, and I guess I see one potential issue with this, though, Mick, and I want to get both you and Shawn's thoughts on this. Is one could argue then, from a plaintiff's perspective, if we make jurors feel good, if the plaintiff side makes jurors feel good, if the plaintiff gives them self-affirmation, could it then not tie right into the fact that they're going to then give a large verdict because they're now feeling good about themselves and they want to make the plaintiff feel good? Or so the point being is there a way that what you were talking about that could spin and go the other way that actually helps the plaintiffs rather than helps the defendant?
Well, if we think of as verdicts as punishments, then it's unlikely that good self-esteem would be correlated with high punishments. On the other hand, somehow if it was framed as like doing a good deed, I mean, it's possible it could be spun that way. I don't know, but and I'd like to cogitate upon that more. But in general, if we're calling an award a punishment, then self-esteem would calm people's tendency to be punitive. Shawn, do you have something you'd like to add to that?
No, I just had a bullet point to make sure that we talk about future research directions, and I think we stumbled into that hole. That's a really good question, Steve. That to kind of in the spirit of Mick's dissertation, flipping it, right? Does the self-esteem promote more liking and belonging and sense of cohesion with the prosecution and that kind of thing? So.
Yeah, and I think that'd be my concern, because here's the reason why I asked that question, is because there's kind of a argument, prevailing thoughts that goes back and forth about whether or not angry jurors are the ones who are responsible for these, as we would call them, nuclear verdicts, shock verdicts, call them whatever you want. But it's angry jurors. It's because jurors are getting pissed off at the defense and then now wanting to punish them. But one could argue, though, that these are actually that the jurors, the more dangerous jurors, are actually the ones who are empowered in order to send a message, the ones that are empowered to right or wrong. And they might do it very level-headed and not be pissed off, and more or less have, like, to what you're talking about, feeling a sense of empowerment to say, we have an opportunity to do something. We have an opportunity to right or wrong. So we're going to go ahead and do that, versus I hate the defendant and I want to see them punished. So I guess that's really kind of the crux of where my question was coming from.
Mm-hmm. I think you're absolutely on the hitting it on the head there, Steve. That it at least from a terror management perspective, the anger and the emotions have very little to do with it. And in fact, in this field of research, the scientists have to demonstrate that the effects are not correlated with the emotional state of participants. So, for example, they have to demonstrate that here's the control group, which just they don't do anything to, and then here's the experimental group where we're bringing thoughts of death and what have you, and then we see what the dependent variable is, like the punitiveness of a death sentencing case, for example. Well, they also have to test that those effects were not due to just garden variety emotions, anger, fear, something like that. So they typically simultaneously ask participants to complete what's often known as the PANAS, the positive and negative affect scale. Basically, it's a well-worn measure of emotions and affective reactivity, which is to say how hot-headed you are. And they consistently show that the emotions are not different between the control group and the experimental group, that these effects really are a kind of cooler calculation, that it really is about people trying to reaffirm their grasp on safety and security, their sense of righteousness, their sense of propriety, but that it's really not correlated with the emotional reactivity. So that speaks to your point exactly, that it's about reestablishing a sense of rightness, but that it's not about being angry, and that in principle, you shouldn't need to rouse their emotions to get these effects.
That right there, you shouldn't have to arouse their emotion to get these effects, I think hits the nail right on the head of what we've been talking about a lot. And I think some people would disagree with us, but we've actually had some research to show that, anger does play a component, but it doesn't play quite an extensive component as some people would think. So I think that's excellent. Shawn, I kind of want to put a little bit of bow on this, but I do want to hear your thoughts about, we kind of get back to what you've seen in your practitioner role about how this kind of terror management theory and how this mortality salience and stuff, how that's been altered or at least, decreased of the priming that you're seeing in the courtrooms that you're working with.
Yeah, that's a great segue. I was thinking and just kind of contemplating as we're talking here the parallels to a lot of the conversation around implicit bias and implicit bias education for legal professionals and judges and whatnot. In that there's something going on between our ears that we tend not to be aware of, and it's impacting how we're making decisions. And that's exactly what we're talking about. It's a little bit of a different process. But where I wanted to land was simply the idea that education itself is an intervention. And what we're doing today, taking this information out and maybe hooking some folks doing this work to learn more about terror management theory, is an intervention in of itself. And it's a larger systems. But this is material that we are routinely covering in judicial education in 2024. And I would even go so far to say that, Mick and I started playing around with this in judicial education, I don't know, 15 years ago or so. It's continued to grow and it's expanding. And now we're talking more to attorneys and whatnot. I will say the the what I would support in kind of moving this forward and better understanding these little nuances and things that you can do actually live on the ground, plus these bigger systems interventions, is this ongoing collaborative research that we do, and all three of us know and love, is interdisciplinary research. And where I'm really enjoying a lot of success is engaging judge scholars, folks working on graduate degrees, PhDs in judicial studies, who are active judges who are working in their courtrooms, and engaging them and thinking through these issues from their perspectives. And we don't have the bandwidth. That's probably a whole nother podcast to talk about that. But these are some really forward-thinking, science-minded, well-educated, and well-grounded in this crazy thing called the brain and the human mind. And personally, in my career, I won't mention how long that's been going, but I have seen the needle move. Yeah, I have seen the needle move. I am seeing progress in this area. So again, hopefully that just kind of sets the stage for some concluding comments. But
yeah, and I think it's extremely important. What I think that the value that both of you bring to this conversation is, one, kind of opening people's eyes to this, like you said. And it didn't even occur to me until Mick and I were talking, and I was like, he had said something about terror management theory, and I said, wait a second, this sounds very familiar to the types of things that I'm seeing. So I think the value of this is, hopefully now there's another angle that people can look at to read that on that topic, which Mick didn't mention, that one of the founders of the whole terror management theory, right, who's written the book, he's actually a direct descendant of Dr. Greenberg, right, Mick?
That's right.
What is the book, if people want to go and read more about? You talked about the initial one, but what was the one that they wrote?
I would say they wrote a paper. It's 3 decades, or it's actually called 3 Decades More of Terror Management Theory, and I believe it's freely available on Google Scholar. Before that, there was a paper, 2 Decades of Terror Management Theory. It was a meta-analysis. They're both excellent, but I think the one I mentioned first, 3 Decades of Terror Management Theory, again, available freely on Google Scholar, and it's actually it's a meta-analysis written by the founders of the theory, so you can't do better than that.
Yeah. So good. If you want to read up on it, I'm going to go read up on it more, because I think this is going to be highly beneficial for my work too. But I think the other point I wanted to make, Shawn, that you guys have brought up is, we've hammered home, and hopefully we've hammered it home on the podcast over and over again, is that there's the legal aspects, and then there's a lot of the psychological aspects that are going on. And a lot of times, how jurors are perceiving evidence, like you might build up a case really, really strong, but what's going on between the ears of the jurors is going to dictate whether or not they do or don't listen to the information, they do or don't grasp onto certain topics. So I think that's another thing that hopefully we bring into the forefront, that there's a lot of psychology of juror decision making that's going on, that's a big portion of what you're seeing in these verdicts.
And judge and attorney decision making.
And that's everybody too, right? Judge and attorney. Forget, right? Not only at the jurors, it's how the judges are sitting on the bench and making rulings, and how they're viewing the evidence. And then the same thing with the attorneys, about how they're working their cases up, or what they're focusing on in order to tap into those psychological aspects.
Exactly.
Mick, I'm going to kick it over to you for any closing comments that you have on this, and then I want you to have an opportunity to plug your website and plug your book that you have.
Thanks very much, Shawn. Steve, excuse me. I'm looking at Shawn on the screen. I have no further comments. If anyone wants to learn more about, say, if you heard this terror management theory, or perhaps even my dissertation, you can look at our website, my company's website, the Science of PCVE. That's the science of, stands for Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism.org. So the Science of PCVE.org. And if you want to know a little more about, like, say, the basis of hate, what makes people hateful and racist, or willing to even commit something like terrorism or violent extremism, well, we wrote a textbook on that topic, and you can get a link to it at that website. And that book is called the Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism: Designing and Evaluating Evidence-Based Programs. So I wish you happy reading and happy hunting. Lots of free articles on our website, so it's totally free. Anything on there is totally freely available. So have fun.
And in your email, is that found on the website, or what's your email, so that if anybody has questions, wants to reach out to you more?
It's a piece of cake. They can reach me directly at m.williams@thescienceofpcve.org, or if they forget that, just go to the website. We have a contact us email, and that'll come right to me.
Thanks. And Shawn, how do people get a hold of you, especially anybody who wants to potentially become a graduate student at the University of Nevada.
Yeah, absolutely. We're obviously always looking for good candidates for the social psychology Ph.D., like my good friend Dr. Wood and Dr. Williams. Also, judges, if any happen to be listening, please do get in touch. My email is SHAWNM, Shawn M, all one word, at unr.edu. And on this topic, anything related to bias and decision making and how it interacts with trauma-informed justice, which is kind of the bread and butter of the work that I do, please do get in touch, and would be delighted to talk to you at any time.
Great. Like I said, I greatly appreciate both of you guys being on. It's good to catch up with you guys. I haven't seen you in a while, and so it was good to hop on and cut it up a little bit. As for anyone else, if you want to reach out to me and talk more about this topic, you can reach me at swood@courtroomsciences.com. Go to courtroomsciences.com for all of our blogs, papers, anything else that you need. There's a contact us link on there as well if you forget the emails. But this has been another edition of the Litigation Psychology Podcast, brought to you by Courtroom Sciences.